I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
In the late 1980s, there was no bigger movie star than Arnold Schwarzenegger. With the Conan movies, the Terminator, Predator, and the surprisingly effective comedy Twins in his back pocket, there weren't many people on this planet, or any other, who didn't know who Arnie was. So when the $65 million sci-fi action thriller Total Recall was released in June 1990, with Arnold's face plastered all over the ads, it seemed a given that the film was going to be a great success. It certainly was, and it's now regarded as one of Schwarzenegger's most engaging and thrilling films. But we wouldn't be here talking about it if the film had an easy road to the big screen. As with so many modern classics, Total Recall took a long time before all the stars aligned and it became a reality. Several directors, producers, actors, and millions of dollars had to change hands before the violent space opera even got made. And we're gonna give you plenty of the gory details. Prepare to get your ass to Mars, because we're gonna tell you what the f happened to Total Recall. Total Recall's long journey to the multiplex started 16 years prior, when a burgeoning writer-producer named Ronald Schwarzenegger bought the rights to a short story called We'll Remember It For You Wholesale, which had been published in 1966. The story was written by one Philip K. Dick, a science fiction author who at the time wasn't at all a known commodity. Shusett bought the rights from Dick for $1,000, with the understanding that Dick would get an extra $9,000 if the story ever got turned into a movie. Shusett knew this was going to be a tall order. While the story doesn't quite resemble what Total Recall would ultimately become, it was still a very ambitious, futuristic tale of a man who always wanted to travel to Mars but opts to have false memories of the trip implanted instead. This leads to many surprises, including the fact that the man may already be a secret agent who has spent time on the Red Planet. Shusett worked on developing the screenplay with an up-and-comer named Dan O'Bannon, who had co-created the bizarre John Carpenter-directed sci-fi comedy Dark Star, as well as worked on Alejandro Jodorowsky's failed adaptation of Dune. Dick's story only ended up providing the first act of the film, with Shusett and O'Bannon having to come up with the rest. Allegedly, before the film actually got rolling, the duo penned over 40 drafts of the screenplay, with the third act being a constant issue for them throughout. Because they couldn't quite crack the script, O'Bannon and Shusett moved on to another project based on an idea of O'Bannon's, about a crew of space travelers terrorized by a vicious alien. This would, of course, go on to become Alien. The film's massive success gave both writers the clout they needed to get their foot in the door of the major studios, so Shusett brought Total Recall, still unfinished, to Disney, which saw potential in the project. According to Shusett, Disney was less interested in the intriguing concepts inherent in the story and more concerned with big action scenes and special effects, since that's what was popular in cinemas, especially overseas. Still, Disney paid him a decent amount of money to develop it. The good times didn't roll for long, as Shusett and Disney disagreed over the direction of the story, leading Shusett to eventually give Disney their money back in return for the rights to the Dick story, which of course shocked the studio. Soon after, Shusett brought the project to the infamous producer Dino De Laurentiis, famous for large-scale productions like King Kong, Flash Gordon, and the Conan movies. Shusett was confident De Laurentiis would freely spend on Total Recall the way he did with many of his films, but the deal would have to come with a catch. Shusett wanted the producer to promise him he wouldn't change a handful of key elements in the script, such as the story ending up on Mars, or the appearance of the mutant rebel leader Quado. Shusett also wanted to share top billing with Dino, for the title card to read Dino De Laurentiis and Ronald Shusett present Total Recall. The producer scoffed at first, but relented because he admired the writer's guts. De Laurentiis eventually agreed to buy the project, and so it finally looked like Shusett's dream project was gonna get made. The question of who would direct was obviously the next important matter at hand. One of the first choices was Richard Rush, who had done the highly acclaimed action comedy The Stuntman, but talks with him fell through. After going through a handful of possibilities, De Laurentiis settled on the Canadian horror maestro David Cronenberg, who was compelled by the story's themes of dual personalities
no shit
and reality versus fantasy. Cronenberg would work on the project for about a year, writing around 12 drafts and instilling the project with his trademark dark, meditative aura. William Hurt was going to play Douglas Quaid as a pathetic, ordinary guy who was sick of his humdrum life. Shusett wasn't happy with the direction Cronenberg was taking them.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not gonna take this anymore!
Telling him he wanted a more audience-friendly picture. Raiders of the Lost Ark Goes to Mars, he would call it, which Cronenberg was not on board with. The producers also opted for Richard Dreyfuss in the lead role in lieu of William Hurt, causing the director even more unhappiness. Ultimately, Cronenberg left the project, although some of his concepts would survive in the final product. Next up was Bruce Beresford, an interesting choice because he was best known for smaller character dramas like Crimes of the Heart and Tender Mercies, and eventually the '89 Best Picture winner Driving Miss Daisy. Beresford got quite far with the project, with Patrick Swayze set to star and pre-production going full speed ahead in his native Australia. Millions of dollars were being spent on set construction until a major snag was hit. De Laurentiis production company went bankrupt. Next thing you know, they're tearing down all the sets they had just built in Australia. The project in limbo. Now's a good time to introduce Arnold into the mix. To his credit, Schwarzenegger had seen the potential early on and had expressed interest in starring in the lead role, but De Laurentiis wouldn't hear of it, thinking him all wrong for the character. With Dino's company mired in problems and Total Recall now up for grabs, Arnold saw his opportunity to become involved. He convinced his friends at Carolco Pictures, who he'd made Red Heat with and who also enjoyed some success with the Rambo movies, to buy the rights, which they did, prompting Arnie to personally call Ronald Schwarzenegger to deliver the good news that the project would move forward. Now a director was needed, once again, and Arnold had just the right guy. Paul Verhoeven, the intense Dutch director who'd recently found great acclaim with RoboCop. Arnold had briefly flirted with starring in RoboCop, but it was found that they couldn't quite build a robo-suit big enough for Arnie's bulky body. Still, Arnold really admired the director and wanted to work with him. For his part, Verhoeven wasn't really looking to do another sci-fi film. Though it turned out to be a great film, RoboCop's complicated visual effects had worn the director down, and he was looking to do something more in line with the dramas he'd been making in the Netherlands before his Hollywood debut. He was receiving lots of effects-heavy scripts that turned him off, but was drawn to Total Recall's more philosophical notions, which he considered more European in tone than your average American blockbuster, as well as the idea that the story might just be a dream or false memory the protagonist is having. Verhoeven agreed to do the movie, but needed work on the script, which, after all this time, still didn't have a satisfactory third act. And Big Trouble in Little China co-writer Gary Goldman was brought on to solve those problems, as well as tailor the script to fit Arnold's persona, transforming Doug Quaid from an ordinary accountant type into a construction worker capable of much more bodily harm. More one-liners and snappy comebacks were added as well, since that presumably is what audience expected from any Schwarzenegger picture. Production was now going to take place in Mexico City, which provided large soundstage suitable for the film's many set pieces. Additionally, the city's interesting architecture, referred to as New Brutalism, appealed to Verhoeven, who appreciated that the exteriors wouldn't resemble your standard metropolis in America. It reportedly took the production team up to 10 months to build all of the sets, around 40 different sets in all on 10 different sound stages, with 3 separate film units filming simultaneously. The budget ballooned to just about $70 million, making it, at the time, the most expensive movie ever made, a distinction it would only hold on to for a year, with Terminator 2 breaking the record in 1991. To add a comfort level, Verhoeven brought on key pieces from his RoboCop team, using the same cinematographer, production designer, and editor, as well as makeup and visual effects maestro Rob Bottin, to help create the movie's various mutants, flesh wounds, and otherworldly visuals. Most of the crew were local, but Verhoeven happily found that everyone was on the same page. Verhoeven knew he couldn't populate the cast with big names since Arnie was the biggest name possible and was getting a gigantic paycheck, so he simply looked for the right people for the right parts. Michael Ironside, who'd come close to playing RoboCop some years earlier, was brought on to play the sociopathic Richter, who chases Quaid from Earth to Mars. Ronny Cox, who played evil executive Dick Jones for Verhoeven in RoboCop, fit easily into his role, the ruthless dictator of Mars. To fill in the key roles of Melina and Lori, the women who play such significant roles in Quaid's life, Verhoeven simply went through the audition process. The director would later say that he saw Rachel Ticotin one day and cast her for her role. Then the next day saw Sharon Stone and cast her for Lori, making it sound like it was the easiest thing in the world because he knew then that they were right for their respective roles. Shooting the film in Mexico was no picnic, as the air quality in Mexico City is legendarily bad, causing multiple crew members to suffer from breathing problems. Perhaps worse, that terrible local illness that attacks many a visitor struck production, Montezuma's Revenge. The stories go that people were vomiting left and right, passing out, and heading to the hospital with regularity, with almost no one spared from the sickness. Producer Elliot Schick was allegedly airlifted off the set to a hospital because he was doing so poorly, and toward the end of production, Verhoeven was often so out of it that they had an ambulance on standby in case he needed emergency attention. For a long while, the only person who went unaffected was Arnold, as he learned his lesson from shooting in Mexico a few years prior on Predator. Arnie brought his own personal cook to the Total Recall set, but when the cook himself fell ill, Arnie found that he had to eat the same things everyone else was eating. He too eventually succumbed to Montezuma's revenge. Verhoeven was serious about Arnold providing a good performance and would sometimes make the actor do anywhere between 20 and 40 takes. The director found that Arnold was up to the task, appreciating the challenge and recognizing that this would have to be his most believable, for lack of a better word, performance to date. Also providing some difficulties for the production were the many special effects utilized, almost all of them practically done using miniatures, elaborate prosthetics, and camera tricks, with one of the only CGI magic moments coming during the X-ray walkthrough scene. Principal members of the visual effects unit were awarded for their hard work 2 years later, when they won a Special Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. After years of development and 6 months of production, Total Recall wrapped in September of 1989. The studio, TriStar Pictures, gave the film a June 15, 1990 release date, meaning there was not a whole lot of time for post-production, at least not for a film of this scale with so many VFX shots. Worse yet, TriStar decided to move the film up 2 weeks to June 1st to get out in front of two highly anticipated releases, Another 48 Hours and Dick Tracy, which meant that its editor had to rush his job to get the film completed in time. Total Recall was not screened for test audiences, which worried Verhoeven and some of the other main participants. Also worrying, the fact that the movie was initially slapped with an X rating due to its large amounts of violence and bloodshed, but that was eventually changed to an R when the director snipped away some of the more egregious gore. Schwarzenegger was very involved in all aspects of the film, and that included the marketing, having input in the trailers, posters, and everything in between. Some weeks before the film, Arnie found out that the film had a general awareness amongst the public of about 43%, which he considered disastrous, so he implored the studio to pump more money into the advertising, eventually raising the awareness all the way up to 99%. The film was indeed released on June 1st, 1990, scoring $25 million in its first 3 days, the best opening of the year until that point, and the biggest opening for an R-rated movie ever at the time. It finished its domestic run with about $119 million, good enough for second best that summer, only behind Ghost. In 1993, it was announced that Ronald Schwarzenegger and Gary Goldman were writing a sequel to Total Recall, which obviously never materialized. In 2012, a remake directed by Len Wiseman, starring Colin Farrell and Bryan Cranston, was released, but it contained none of the fresh, eccentric elements that makes the Verhoeven film so special. It was dead on arrival and quickly forgotten. All these years later, it's safe to say Total Recall remains among the best movies Arnold, Verhoeven, and many of the others involved have ever done. It's still endlessly quotable. The visual effects are a bit dated, sure, but are still very eye-catching. And the complex story is as inspired and enjoyable as most of the output you see in the genre today. Throw in some Arnold at his peak, and that's a marriage you would not want to divorce from.